Hello, and welcome to our session Beyond the Image. I'm Jen Scharf, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Marketing at LHH. And I'm here today with Lizette Williams, Global Head of Solutions Marketing at Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us, Lizette. I think this is going to be an engaging conversation. I'm excited to be here today with you. Just to sort of tee up the session a little bit, I think, as we dive into diversity and inclusion and the impact on brands, it's such an interesting time for brands. And in many ways, I think, and tell me what your thoughts are, but I think it's a defining point on really how they're going to continue to what I call show up, right, in the eyes of consumers who probably today have really specific expectations around a brand's position on diversity and inclusion. And most certainly today, as we all know, consumers have a much larger microphone through social media to amplify their views. So it's kind of a really interesting pivot point. And I think, these expectations certainly have been driven by the growth and dynamic impact of communities of women, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, and certainly people of color. And it's, I think, becomes certainly an imperative for marketing leaders today, now more than ever, to ensure that all voices are seen, heard, and appropriately addressed. And as we know, consumers are really looking to align where they spend their money to brands that really fit their views. So I'd really like to dive into this a little bit more with you and garner your perspectives, certainly, Lizette, on the role of brands and marketing leaders in today's world. And to just kind of kick us off today, 2020, a year unlike any other for so many reasons. What would you say maybe were some of the biggest teachable moments and how they'll shape diversity and inclusion in the years to come?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm so excited to be here and to be having this conversation with you. And I agree, 2020 was a wake-up moment for all of us. I think as individuals, as organizations, and especially for our brands. There were several things that were occurring during this time. No surprise, the COVID pandemic, which had us all home, which increased the proliferation of digital engagement with our consumers, which was already increasing to begin with, but it really amplified the connection to consumers and the power that consumers have in talking about our brands and capturing a cultural moment and really making it their own. I think secondarily, the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. Like, let's be honest, that was a huge wake-up call, not just for our country, but for our companies. Because finally, I think America had to stand up and realize that systemic racism and inequality were very real things. These things were not imagined. They were sitting right in front of us. And all of a sudden, we were being called on the carpet and really driving accountability in our role in really fighting against that. And to me, it was a seismic shift like no other, like nothing else we've ever seen. I've worked in diversity marketing for a long time, but there was an awakening. There was a reckoning that happened where organizations, companies, brands had to finally stand up and acknowledge it and talk about how they would be part of the solution. And the primary reason was that consumers demanded it. Consumers demanded it, and they screamed it, and it got amplified. And we could no longer take a back seat to the conversation or, stick it in the HR function and worry about it through recruiting or just be silent on issues that really matter. The fact of the matter is this is impacting the future of commerce and the viability of our organizations. And so I think it was a pivotal moment. I'm anxious and excited to see the long-term effects of this because I think we saw some short-term impact. But I do think that this is a seismic shift and what will be a sustainable change, I hope, for organizations in this country.
Yeah, I totally agree, Lizette. I think, 2020, unprecedented year, many teachable moments for sure. Diving in a little further, as we think about, what we call today purpose-driven marketing, it's certainly become obviously a bigger priority. Consumers are expecting it, as we talked about, more and more from brands. And they're, what are some maybe best practices that you would recommend or things that you would highlight weaving diversity and inclusion into a lot of the more purpose-driven marketing efforts with their target audiences? What would that look like moving forward?
It's really a great question. And I really see this as a three-faceted model when you're evaluating a brand's direction in purpose-driven marketing. So first is just an in-depth understanding of the brand. And what is your brand position? What does it stand for? Where does it have permissibility to be and not? And I think that's really, really important, because I think some brands are very permissible in areas that are important, and some brands are not. And it's important to acknowledge the role of your brand and the role that it plays, and to play in your lane. I think a lot of times when we see brands get in trouble is because they steered out of their lane, they're steered out of who they are, what they believe in, and what they stand for as a brand. So as marketers, we first have to have an in-depth understanding of that. The second part of that is a really deep understanding of consumer insights. We should not be out here trying to launch purpose-driven marketing campaigns without doing extensive consumer research on the campaign itself, the language that is being used, the channel that is being used to communicate the message, and how we really think about the consumer implications and the reaction to said message when your brand is associated with it. I did a lot of research like this when I was at McDonald's and launched Black and Positively Golden, looking at it both unbranded and branded to really understand what the consumer reaction was going to be with our brand integrated into some of the messaging that we had. And we had to make shifts on the messaging, and it was important to understand that. And I think the last part of this is a deep understanding of the cultural moment, and understanding the moment in time and being very attuned to the climate and what is happening. We've seen brands fall on tone deaf ears, right? We've seen those moments when they weren't really attuned to the pulse of the cultural moment. And so they might have been in alignment with the brand, they might have done the consumer insight work, but they didn't really think about the moment in time where the messaging was going out. And was this an insensitive moment to really launch that? And I think it's a trifecta of really looking at those three key things and making sure in combination that it's the right moment, in line with your brand's positioning, and absolutely in line with the consumer insight that's driving the said campaign.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you think about that, because I think sometimes what happens is you may not go as deep in some of those consumer insights, and you're also not keeping your eye, as you say, on kind of those key moments that are happening in the world, right? And kind of being able to be agile, as we talk about in today's marketing world, and being able to kind of flex and drive the right things at the right time. So I think it takes a different kind of mindset as we
Absolutely.
kind of look at this. Talking about some things with brands that maybe, if they're thinking about them not necessarily hitting the right mark, right, at the right time, maybe talk a little bit about things that a brand could do to course correct if there is a misstep, right, in terms of how they've approached, something that they're putting out into the market, or quite honestly, if they've completely missed the boat in incorporating diversity in the right way. What are some things that you would advise in that regard?
It's a great question. And I actually think it's something that we'll see more and more of, given the amount of social cause marketing and racial justice marketing that's being put into the marketplace right now. A couple of key things that are important. I think first and foremost is acknowledging the misstep. There has to be an acknowledgement of the misstep that happened. And in a very honest and authentic way, speak with authenticity. Have empathy for the consumer and the acknowledgement of the misstep. This is your moment to really connect with your consumers in a very human way, and to stand up and receive, what happened and how your brand is going to react to that. So once it's acknowledged, once an apology, an authentic apology that empathetically connects with your consumers is communicated, I also think there needs to be an action. And not a moment in time action. I'm talking about a long-term plan, and a long-term commitment to reverse the misstep. Consumers can see right through when it's just a media stunt or PR stunt to react to something. And so brands really need to think about the long-term impact that they're looking to have in the social justice space, and what that means for them, and put dollars and resources against it, and make sure that not only are they acknowledging and apologizing, they're demonstrating a real actionable and authentic commitment. And I think that is so critical. And I think consumers will respect that.
Yeah. How long do you think, from a misstep perspective, it's really critical on sort of that initial acknowledgement, right? And how they begin to pivot and kind of bring people along their, I guess what I would call a learning journey, right? Sort of acknowledging we didn't hit this right, we're still learning. I've seen some organizations maybe dive internal as a way to maybe garner the right position on how they and how their employees feel and connect that to external. Would you have any perspectives on that, just in how they might connect in the right way with employees, or maybe things that you've seen organizations and brands do?
Yeah, I think it depends on the situation, and this needs to be managed on a case by case basis. I certainly think that employees are a critical part of understanding the consumer. I anticipate employees could be a lot closer to the segment and getting their feedback, and ensuring that you're working from the inside out is also critically important. So you can't be out advocating for diversity or social justice causes, but you're having a diversity problem in your organization, right? You can't go out and say you're going to support a major African-American organization, but your entire board of directors and your entire C-suite is not diverse. Like it's not just about the external communication to consumers. It's also about taking a serious look inside and understanding what the deep internal commitment is to making the shift. And that's why I think this time has been so interesting for us, because it's both internal and doing the work and reframing the organizations, but it's also external and connecting with consumers in a way that's authentic and actionable.
Right. Certainly, as we talked about, a big sort of a pivot point for brands and companies as they're thinking about their internal functions and departments as well. When we dive more into sort of a marketing function, how can marketers today, build trust with clients, customers, and certainly internally, especially not limited to situations where, your marketing team in and of itself may have some progress to make toward inclusion in the makeup of the team and so forth. Any thoughts around that as we dive more into the marketing world?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, there's so many pieces of this that I think we need to dissect in terms of how to really build trust. I think doing a lot of the internal work and I've done this at Kimberly-Clark, I've done it at other organizations that I've worked at, is looking across the system and the operations of how things go to market and really dissecting where diverse considerations are being integrated into that work. So that's everything from recruiting your employees to supplier diversity to how you're thinking about birthing a big idea and how you're bringing diverse agencies to the table as part of that conversation, to how you're thinking about your diverse media and the integration of that into your media channel mix. It is literally an end-to-end system that needs to be overhauled, evaluated, and have accountability driven against it. And I think developing some level of a scorecard in the end-to-end system and having key KPIs against each one of those touch points in the marketing end-to-end process is of critical importance. So I think it's a lot bigger than people anticipate, but we have to do the work now. And we have to really evaluate how we're operationalizing going to market and fighting systemic inequality. And that's how it happens. It happens from the inside and really beginning to eliminate things that have gotten in our way throughout the marketing system.
I completely agree. And when we think about those KPIs and how you're going to build that scorecard, one of the things that strikes me is it's probably important for marketing to really be partnering not only obviously within their own team, but other functions across the organization. If you were to talk about maybe who are maybe some of the most valuable players and partners that marketing should really rely on when building sort of a more authentically inclusive marketing, initiative and tying back to those KPIs that you were talking about, who maybe are some of those key folks within the organization that we should really be centering and really locking hands with as we move forward?
Yeah, and I think this needs to touch all parts of the organization. Like, this isn't a marketing issue. This is an organizational issue. So I think almost every single piece of the organization should be affected by this if done correctly. So you think about, obviously your HR function is critically important as you think about the supply of diverse talent and retention, but down to like finance. Like nobody thinks about this. So how are we thinking about measuring financial objectives? How are we thinking about the size of the opportunity for diverse consumer segments? And is that being measured and tracked appropriately so then we can resource those segments appropriately? You know, we don't think about that, but we should be talking about it. How are we thinking about the operations of the organization? And do we have diverse suppliers in the pipeline of the product that we're trying to make? It literally hits the entire gamut if done correctly to go to market in an effective way, in a way that's really driving systemic change. So I think it's everybody, and it's really starting to dissect all of the issues at play, where the touch points are. I've done this with other organizations. I brought in consultants often to help me to start to think through that entire streamlined process and where we can affect change. And by the way, it pays off. There's always a return on investment in the end. When done correctly, there's always a return on investment. It's not any different than any other major organizational project that you would take on.
Right. Where do you think companies are today? Just, obviously given 2020 and, the rise of this area, where do you think brands are today in terms of maturity to be able to really think differently? And as we talked about in the beginning, sort of show up differently and do the work, quite honestly, is I think what you were just talking about. What's your perception today on kind of where we are?
I think it depends. And I think what we're seeing is a broad spectrum in maturity. I think there are some brands that are far more developed and have been engaging with diverse segments and have built organizations that stands for these things and have been in the game for a long time. And there are some that are just getting started and are in the infancy stages and are well-intentioned and have well-intentioned executive teams, but are really not quite sure what to do. And I think you can see that when you look at the proliferation of chief diversity officer roles in 2020. I know a lot of them are my friends. They got hired. Everybody's creating a CDO role. They don't know what to do. That's the first place they go. Well, I certainly hope that they're empowering those individuals to really drive actionable change and giving them the resources they need to do that. So I think it depends. I think we're seeing a broad gamut. I think the vast majority are in the infancy stages and still trying to figure it out. And we, I work for a media organization. I think agencies, we're going to have to help our clients through the process of getting there. I've been getting a ton of those phone calls these days on how to really think about this and address it with companies that are trying to figure it out. The good news is that they're trying to figure it out.
Right.
And that's a big step.
Do you think it's appropriate for a brand to sort of own that, if they're at the beginning stages and really kind of maybe open up the dialogue with their audiences and just sort of own where they are in the process that they're learning? To me, that drives maybe some authenticity and maybe engaging consumers to help them really think differently. But I was curious your thoughts on that.
I think it requires consumer research. It's hard for me to definitively say that you need to have that level of transparency with your consumers without understanding the dynamics of the brand. There are some brands that have long not spoken to diverse consumers. So if your first messaging out the gate is we're trying to figure it out, feel like that's not going to land well. Right. And there's some brands that have that credibility. I think the internal work needs to be done. I launched the Black and Positively Golden campaign at McDonald's. It was our overhaul of our African American targeted campaign. 9 months of research went into that before we went out the door. And we pivoted a bunch of times going through that and connected with African American consumers and got the messaging right. What we did not do is go out and tell African American consumers we didn't know what we were doing. What we did was go out and figure out how to get it right and talk to them directly. And then when we felt like we cracked it, we launched it and we did it in a major, major way.
Yeah. How did you bring some internal folks, like the internal organizations that you were part of at McDonald's as an example? How were they part of maybe that newer solution and how you were going to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's objective. Like we're here to drive a business. I don't sit in an HR function. I never have. So when you think about the power of spend and the power of these consumers, not only the segments themselves and how we think about the size of the segment and their ability to spend and their purchasing power, but also the influence that they have on mainstream culture. What brands are trying to do right now is drive cultural relevance, right? Every brand in the world will tell you we'd love to be culturally relevant. We'd love to figure out a way to tap into consumers and to be part of top of mind cultural conversation. Well, think about who's driving culture. Who are the real purveyors of culture who set trends? They're diverse people. So I figured out a way not only to come up with an opportunity size based on the segmentation itself, but also to think about the impact that the segment had on broad-based culture and how they were in fact leaders. And so we should be leading with some of these insights. We should be thinking about them first when we think about general market work. And there's a much bigger opportunity in thinking about that. And I was able to make a business case, by the way, with an associated ROI and an associated revenue model with it. It's a business conversation on why we should be doing this and what was the best way to think about it moving forward.
Terrific. Yeah, it's so critical, I think, to really think through end to end, to have it really land right, to have it be impactful, and to make sure that it kind of the way that you are maneuvering and driving forward, that it sticks, right? So it's consistent, and you're going to continue down that path. So it sounds like you had a really great way of approaching it, and you got some return out of it as well that could be demonstrated. You know, talking just to dive into a little bit about maybe some overlooked audiences as we think about that when it comes to brand engagement and what marketers maybe need to do to course correct a little bit as they think. Obviously, we just talked about some of those consumer insights and so forth, but how do we make sure that they're really broadening the lens of the consumers that you want to get insights from, you know, moving forward? And if there have been some missteps, what should they do to course correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think the work really begins with research. There's a big research issue in the industry. People have heard me talk about it. Brands go out and spend millions of dollars to do these broad-based segmentations to come up with behavioral segments for marketing, right? Every brand does this. We should be out getting representative samples of diverse populations as part of that process. If we effectively designed the segmentation that was reflective of a diverse population, we wouldn't need to go out and do all this like extra work trying to figure out what African American consumers think or Hispanic consumers think or Asian, because it's part of the work that we do as a day-to-day business, as a day-to-day organization. So I'm like a vehement believer in like doing the right level of consumer research, of pushing our major research partners to do it the right way and design it the right way for us to get the insights that we need, so then we can go out and communicate effectively to those consumers.
Right. That's terrific, and I think really good insights, especially when you think about it's expensive, right? When you're working on market research, you want to make sure that it's not just research that you're doing for today. You're really thinking for the longer term so that you get that impact. So I completely.
It's interesting. It's research. It is research for today because the diverse consumers are here. So this isn't like it's going to happen in 10 years. It's happening now. 40% of millennials are diverse. The interesting thing about the research, and I've done tons of research, is that they'll charge you an upcharge to recruit a representative sample of a diverse segment, which I never understood. Right? Like the representative sample size of a millennial study is 40% of are diverse, but when we talk about systemic inequality in this marketing system. But because the research vendors often have a harder time recruiting diverse populations for whatever reason, then the client has to pay an upcharge to get to a certain level of Spanish-speaking Hispanic consumers or a certain level of African American consumers. I think clients should be standing up and saying, we're not going to pay an upcharge on research that is just part of a representative sample of people of color that are part of this country. And you, Beja research vendor, go figure out how you operationalize that for us.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's going to cause a lot in the market research areas and companies for them to kind of rethink how they're going to go out and be able to provide that value back so that we have the right insights moving forward. Completely agree. Considering too they're usually quite pricey to begin with. As we're sort of winding down a little bit, I wanted to touch a little bit on today, brands, the way that consumers are really interacting due to COVID, obviously, spending much more time online versus face-to-face. Frequency is really amplified for sure. How do you think maybe that move to everything being online now and how we're interacting at a much more rapid pace has impacted D&I initiatives, and maybe some best practices that those initiatives and folks in marketing can ensure that those best practices are staying top of mind as people continue to connect virtually? I don't think this virtual world is going to necessarily go away overnight, so we're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. I mean, personally, I spent 13 years in brand marketing roles, 8 years on like deep diving into brand and culture, and I left that to go to a digital media company. Very intentionally, by the way, because I do think this is the future of consumer engagement. And it honestly didn't take COVID for that to happen. It was happening before. What I think the pandemic did was really accelerate for a lot of more traditional organizations. It accelerated it and almost forced them to acknowledge that digital media really is the way forward. So it's interesting now. I love it. I mean, it's a marketer's dream. Like, you're literally getting real-time feedback on any work you put out there. And the technology actually allows you to pivot real time. An ad's not working for you, a piece of copy is not working for you. You can real time pull it and check and adjust. You can test things in different environments. The ability to consumer target in the digital environment is amazing. And when you really think about behavioral targeting, and the in-depth way that we can really engage. We've never had more information. We've never been able to connect with our consumers in a more intimate way. And so as a marketer, I get really excited about that. From a D&I perspective, we don't have any excuse. There's literally no excuse for you to go out and say, I don't know how I should be connecting with diverse consumers. There's a plethora of information. There are a plethora of groups online. You can tap into those conversations. You can leverage social listening. You can follow influencers and get to the pulse of the culture and know what conversations are happening and what is top of mind and how your brand can tap into that. So I think it's an exciting time. I think it's a time where we have more information at our disposal and at a time where we can leverage behavioral targeting techniques and digital platforms to be much more highly efficient as well as highly effective.
I agree. And I think at a base level, it only, I think, reinforces this sort of, we're online. We were online before COVID, but it's amplified now.
Absolutely.
From just the perspective of the investment in the technology that we can get that real-time insight to be able to pivot and move. I think it's become so critical for marketers today to make sure we have the right infrastructure set up to be able to do that. And I know a lot of brands, big and small, are sort of constantly evolving with the moving and shaking of technology to enable those pieces. So it'll be interesting to sort of see where it continues to go. So. Absolutely. Yeah. I know we're sort of nearing the end of our session, but maybe, wanted to talk a little bit more on a personal note with you. What maybe has been some of the most difficult lessons that you've learned throughout your career, and, maybe some key takeaways that you could share with our audience today?
I love that question. And it's been such a pleasure, by the way, talking to you. I think this has been a great conversation. Probably, and I have so many, we could probably spend an entire segment talking about this topic, but one of the biggest ones, there's a quote by Oprah Winfrey, who is one of my heroes, that says, you get in life what you have the courage to ask for. And I think coming up in corporate as a young woman of color, there were times where I was scared to ask for what I really wanted. And I have a lot of hard knock stories of figuring it out along the way. And now I ask for what I want. And I do it in a way that is unapologetic and clear. And I think that takes some time as you grow into your career to have that level of confidence in your ability and the work that you're bringing forward and the value you're creating. But I would say just asking for what I want and having the courage and the confidence to do that has been critically important.
That's amazing. And I think that's so, it's key, particularly, I think for women for sure coming up, and really getting kind of that bigger seat at the table in today's world. So really, I completely agree and love it for sure. So I think we're nearing the end of our time, but I just wanted to really thank you, Lizette. This has been a great dialogue, super information that you've shared today, and certainly a powerful conversation. So many great takeaways. I appreciated your insights, and I'm sure our audience has as well. And I just want to say thanks for everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you. This has been amazing. Appreciate the opportunity.